Welcome to Bishop Barron Presents. I'm Jared Zimmer, the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute. And in this episode, Bishop Barron sits down with Dr. Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen to discuss her two books, and particularly the history of ideas that shaped American culture. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Jennifer, wonderful to have you here with us, and Bishop Barron as always, to discuss your wonderful books, American Nietzsche and the Ideas That Made America. I thoroughly enjoyed these reads, and for all of our viewers, I definitely recommend them, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So
Thank you.
I thought maybe one of the first questions that I'd like to ask is, why is it so important for us to really understand the history of ideas? Sort of how did we get to where we are today?
That is the favorite question you could possibly ask an intellectual historian. So my area of specialty is American intellectual history, so the history of ideas, the history of intellectual movements. And what drew me to it was really the ideas, first and foremost. Whatever, I loved getting my mind, into those thorny theoretical issues. But at a certain point in my late, I guess as a teenager, as a college student, my mind started to ask, well, why then and why there? Why did that person think that? And what my mind was doing, I didn't know, was asking a historical question, right? So in order to understand an idea, an argument, a thesis, a book, what is it about that context that is either conditioning the possibilities for that thinker to think the way he or she is thinking? What are the pressures on him or her at that moment to come up with those ideas? How are those ideas a reflection of that moment? And so that's what that's how I think about what it is I do. I mean, it's fundamentally, it can be a philosophical pursuit, a theological pursuit, but it's what makes it historical is the always asking that question of the, why then and why there, so that the context is as important as the idea itself.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You also don't lose the thinker himself or herself along the way as well. So
Exactly.
the biographical information gets, you understand the influences.
Exactly. And so that's also so important. Sometimes ideas become isms.
Yes.
Names become, adjectives. Yeah. So Marxian or Marxist, right? But what is it to go back to the original source of an idea, really grounded in a human being, grounded in their lived experience? And so that's one of the fundamental habits of mind, if you will, of how I do what I do, what intellectual history. The other thing, and this is the part that I say to my students when I'm trying to, convince them to stay with me, when they look at the syllabus and they see the reading list and they think, oh, no, is that there is not a single debate in American life today that doesn't have a history. None of this is coming ex nihilo. None of it just parachuted down during the Trump presidency or during this or during, 9/11. None of this. Whether it's a debate about morality, about religion, about economics, about our politics, about our identity as Americans, these are questions, conversations, debates, sometimes really bitter fights that have really, 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 really long histories. And so what intellectual history does, or what I try to do in these books, is to help us break out of our blinkered perspective. We're so caught in our moment. What happens when we start to think about our now as a long now, and sometimes a really, really long now? And so that's another thing that I try to bring out in my work and in my teaching. The cool thing is that it lets you keep company with people from the past, right? So if you're dealing today with whatever the issue is, the hot button issue, and we feel like, we're in it and it's so hard, you're not in it alone. Because there were a lot of really, really, really smart and sometimes not so smart, sometimes beautiful minds and sometimes not so beautiful minds. But there's a long conversation, and you can bring them into your own the inner conversation too. So I think about intellectual history as a way of keeping company with the past
Yeah.
and confronting whatever moral, political, economic issue of our moment with these resources, from other people who wrestled with an earlier iteration of the same problem.
Yeah, I always think about the language that Mortimer Adler gave it, the great conversation,
Yeah.
to partake in that. Bishop, same question, especially in regard to your work.
Ideas have consequences. I think it's so fundamental, but a lot of people don't believe that. They think, well, there's this sort of high academic conversation, what are bandied about in classrooms and university lecture halls and Parisian coffee houses. It has nothing to do, with the real world and real life. There's nothing falser than that, in my experience. All these ideas have a way of trickling down to all parts of the culture. I gave a sermon, maybe 20 years ago now, where I said, I think the most influential 19th century philosopher is not Karl Marx, it's Friedrich Nietzsche. I said that 20 years ago. And I still believe that, which is why when I saw your book on the shelf in Dallas, I said, yep, American Nietzsche, that Nietzsche has really influenced our culture. But those who say, oh, Nietzsche, all this highfalutin academic stuff, no way. It finds its way through all kinds of avenues into the ordinary conversation and ordinary behavior. Because I would argue, we may get into this, I think a lot of Nietzsche's views are the default position of many teenagers in America today. When I deal with people on YouTube and I'm making a video about religion, you'll hear Nietzsche. They might not know it, but they've gotten a Nietzschean influence. So, and actually, I find this in a very negative way in the church sometimes. It's all this theological and philosophical, we're concerned with caring for the people. Well, great. The church is always about caring for the people, but that highfalutin philosophical level has a huge impact on how a culture is shaped, how it unfolds, how people behave. So I think it's massively important, the kind of work you do, that we understand where these things come from and how the culture gets shaped.
Yeah, and so often it leaves academy and goes into pop culture. You find it in movies and music, and so people are being formed in these ideas regardless of knowing who it is.
Yeah.
So to your point, knowing the history, it gives even more of a perspective whenever
Yeah.
you're watching films or you're listening to music or attending a talk. You know about the process that got us to that point.
Yeah, or at least it alerts me to a question. Sometimes
Yes,
I don't
yeah.
know the answer, but at least it raises the question, how did that come to be? Why is
Yeah.
that? I liked something that you said about the ideas that have consequences. So one way that I put it in my writing and in my teaching is that thinking is where the historical action is at. Not quite the same thing, but in that same territory, right? So not that ideas are just here in some
Right.
other realm,
Right.
for other, whether it's an elite conversation or it's remote, airy-fairy, otherworldly,
Yeah.
but then there's the real world, right?
Right.
The real, no. And that's also the habit of mind that I think I bring to my own work and is common for intellectual historians is to say, no, that never is the case.
It's never the case,
It's
right.
never the
Yeah,
case.
right.
Whether the ideas are highly articulate or they're more diffuse, they're there. And they're not there simply as a rationalization for the real work
Right.
of politics or the real work of economic, right? That they're there as agents in history as well.
Right, and we've talked about this, my job is to evangelize the culture. That's how we see the role of Word on Fire. And you can't evangelize the culture unless you know it. And so the American culture, what shaped it? To say, oh, I'm not interested in ideas, I want to get down there and do my ministry. Well, you can't do one without the other. No one that is interested in actually addressing our culture, who doesn't understand all these sources, is going to fail at it. One of my mentors is Cardinal George of Chicago, who died about 5 years ago, and that was his great theme. And of course, he was influenced by St. Pope John Paul II, evangelize the culture. Therefore, the church has got to get in the intellectual game, which we have been from the beginning, our great
of
people
course.
from the church fathers on. But I'll be honest with you, in my lifetime, there's been a strong strain of anti-intellectualism in the church, and that's done us enormous harm. That'd be a topic for another day maybe, but I think it has done us enormous harm at a number of levels, but this is one of them. We don't understand the culture we're trying to evangelize. We'll do a lousy job evangelizing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and to understand American culture, I thought that your book, The Ideas That Made America, really portrays kind of the process along the way for us to get to where we are right now. And I thought maybe one of the first questions I'd love to kind of start off with, of American culture in particular, is what was the role of religion in regard to the American founding? How did it shape people's way of thinking about law and culture and all of that?
So the answer is a lot. It comes as a surprise to some readers, and others are intimately familiar with this. But it is not a stretch to say that the American Revolution was also a religious movement as well. Sure. What do I mean by that? It is to say that many of the ideas about liberty, freedom, self-sovereignty was actually espoused from ministers at their pulpits. So one of the great ways in which Enlightenment ideas made its way into American culture was by way of the learned clergy. Yeah. So there wasn't a sacred and secular. There wasn't this imagined firewall between these two realms at all. If we just back up a little, when we think about why most Europeans made their way to America in the first place, it was seeking religious, not all, some were seeking wealth, earthly wealth. Yeah. So I shouldn't gussy it all up, but a good portion of early immigrants to America are coming for religious freedom. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's too much a stretch to say that religion, having religion central in one's life, was already sort of baked into the DNA leading up to the revolution. Yeah. There's so much to say here. I think the go-to text for me on this, and it's a text that I discuss in the book, it's an obvious one, is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Yes. And so Common Sense uses very much biblical imagery, the stories from the Bible, perhaps in ways that might raise eyebrows to some readers, but and there's still a longstanding debate, was Thomas Paine just using biblical language to try to appeal to what he knew was a religious population, right? To get them to see themselves, to see their struggle with England in a sort of biblical frame? Or was he himself a genuine person of faith? That's still up for debate. I'm inclined to say that actually he was a person of faith. But the language, it's a deeply religious text and uses religious language to help embolden colonists to throw off the yoke of British imperialism. So again, it's right there, central to the story.
Yeah. It's such a complicated question, you're right, and it's fascinating to me that you might say two great strains in America. One is a strong rationalist Enlightenment strain, another a strongly religious, for all the reasons you say. But then even within the Enlightenment strain, you've got a religious element, if you want. So the kind of deist, more rationalized form of religion in Jefferson, nevertheless, something like religion. So there it is from the beginning. Also, your point about freedom. The fact that Martin Luther writes a text called The Freedom of a Christian, I think is extraordinarily important as that tradition comes up from religion into society and the integrity of the individual over and against a oppressive institution. A lot of that more Protestant way of thinking about individual in relation to institution, I think certainly affects the American mentality. But I see those two strains to the present day. There's a rationalistic strain for sure within America and a deeply religious one. And they keep asserting themselves, intertwining in interesting ways, sometimes at odds, sometimes each one complementing the other. So in some ways, that's the story of America culturally, I think, are those, how do you read those two things together?
Right. My apologies.
No,
I was going to say you mentioned Jefferson and the intertwining. Things always get interesting in the intertwining. Yeah. So I think of Jefferson's Bible as a prime example of intertwining. So the American Revolution, if we think about this as part of the Enlightenment project, if you will, right? Like you don't get the American Revolution, in my view, without the Enlightenment ideas. Yeah. As John Adams said, a change had to happen in the heads and hearts of Americans for them to even want to, throw off to even embark on a revolution, right? So that the first shift had to be a mental and a moral one, or change of heart. The difference between the American Enlightenment, so not necessarily as we see it manifested in the Revolution, but just in its wider consequences, was that it was never as hostile to religion as the Enlightenment was. We've come to know it in France, right? Okay. And the pathway as I'm sure your listeners all know, goes by way of the French Revolution.
Yeah.
That's a very different
story.
game,
right.
So
Yeah.
that was never our revolution,
Right.
It did not have anything like that degree of anti-clericism and that hostility to religion. And here's where you get the intertwining. So our Enlightenment was always infused, whether you want to say it was pantheist or deistic or a burgeoning form of liberal Protestantism or whatever you want to call it, there was a religious or spiritual dimension, even to the thinkers that we've come to think of as stoutly secular thinkers. So
Right.
I'm pointing to you because you mentioned Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
Jefferson comes up with his own Bible
Yeah.
in the early 19th century. Like, this is a classic
But
Enlightenment
denuded
text.
of anything supernatural.
Right. So, I mean, again, he really gerrymanders his way through the Bible. But that is an American Enlightenment mind at work,
It's
right?
Kant, right? Religion comes
Yeah.
down to ethics.
Right.
And so he anticipates Kant in many ways that way, saying that the New Testament's all about ethics. Let's get rid of miracles and about
Yeah.
Jesus being divine, et cetera. So, right, it's an Enlightenment
So, I mean, it's a
project.
gerrymandered,
Yeah.
it's a gerrymandered Bible
Yeah.
for sure. But that's Jefferson's effort to say certainly the ethical infrastructure that comes to him by way of the Bible is crucial.
Yeah.
So how is it I can just rework some of this to get rid of the stuff that can no longer stand at the
Right.
bar of the Enlightenment mind?
Right.
So again, I just think that that's such a classic example of the peculiarity of the American Enlightenment and how important, whether you want to call it, it's certainly not, in Jefferson's sense, a kind of standard institutional religious faith.
Right, but it's
But
something.
It's something.
Can I ask you something? Because I mentioned Cardinal George already, and maybe our listeners, maybe this cartoon's been gone so long, but remember Calvin and Hobbes, the
Yeah, of
cartoon?
course,
He
yeah.
used to say, America is shaped by Calvin and Hobbes. And his point being, by a very Protestant approach to religion, Calvin, and a very Hobbesian approach to political philosophy, the individual, the war of all against all, social contract, and so on. So to understand America, just think Calvin and Hobbes, But it raises the issue of Catholicism. Because to say Calvin is to say a Protestant influence, which is certainly there, and what he
Right.
said about freedom and the individual and so on. And the Catholic social theory is different. It's much more communitarian.
Yeah.
And much more institutional, if you want to put it that way. And then Hobbes is not Thomas Aquinas. For Thomas, politics is natural to us. It's not just a social contract. We're not by nature antagonistic to each other. We're by nature political. And so Hobbes represents a divorce from that view, as Calvin represents a divorce from a Catholic theological understanding. So I just find that interesting. Calvin and Hobbes, I think, are influential. So where does it leave Catholics in America? To me, it's just a very interesting question.
Yeah, and that's kind of my next question is what was the role of Catholicism in particular? I mean, did it play a major role in the shaping of the founding of America?
Yes, because Catholics were here and also fighting the same fight. I think where things get tricky, of course, is when this is already there, at the founding, where Protestants and Catholics are looking at each other with suspicion, right? So they've a shared fight. They've shared internal enemies. So worried about Native Americans, concerned about slaves as enemies in their midst. They've got a common enemy abroad, but they also historically. So and then of course this just really, if you will. Becomes even more intense over the course of the 19th century as we have more and more immigrants from
Yeah.
Catholicism. Catholics have a big stake in this history, and it's partly fighting off the criticism of Protestants that you cannot be a Democrat and be
Yeah.
faithful,
Yeah,
to a
right.
pope abroad, right? Like you cannot do that. And Catholics saying over and over again, well, no, just watch us, like let us show you how to do it. So that's a sort of high-flying answer, but it is to say that all of these contestations, Catholics are in this conversation. Sometimes they're the specter, this is what American freedom is up against, but oftentimes they're not only interlocutors, but they're setting the agenda by saying both things are possible, right?
Yeah.
Being
Yeah.
faithful to this place and being Catholic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To that point, I think of two American archbishops, namely John Carroll. And as we record these words, it's the 200th anniversary this summer of the establishment of the Baltimore Basilica. And when John Carroll laid the foundation stone for that, Carroll, who was a friend of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, and he said, this is a monument to religious liberty. And so he saw it's a monument to Catholics belong here. Then go forward a little bit from him, and one of his successors, Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore, who upon becoming cardinal goes over and gives a speech in Rome at Santa Maria in Trastevere and sings the praises of the American political arrangement. You know, it was not the classically Catholic way to think about it, but to say, look, we're flourishing in this country, you know. So there is a very strong strain, you're right, of Catholics saying, no, we belong here, we're at home here. Other Catholics, of course, both 19th century and today, would say, well, no, there's a more awkward relationship between classical Catholicism and the American arrangement. That, too, I think, is an interesting intertwining. Catholics who say yes to it and Catholics who are more suspicious of the American arrangement. Read Vatican II now under that rubric, as Vatican II makes a strong statement for religious liberty, but read the debates around that. So anyway, I find that interesting too, is how do we adjudicate those complex issues?
Yeah, and so often too, we focus in on the kind of colonial realities
Right.
of the founding, but there was also in the Southwest over to California
Yeah.
a lot of Catholicism that was flourishing and growing communities and influencing America in a major way, just on a different coast, different area of the United States.
Where
So-
we are right now.
Exactly.
So we're at this
Exactly.
mission in Santa Barbara. I mean, right here, at the time of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, right in the 1770s, that's when Junipero Serra was establishing all these missions. And there's a flourishing Catholic culture in what's now America, but we hardly ever think about that. We focus on the colonial side of the equation.
Yeah. Something interesting as well, and you mentioned Thomas Paine, this kind of culture of self-invention that Bishop Barron's used that language a few times, that we now have. I found that in Paine as well, this idea of I can become who I want to be. But where did that come from? Was that more of an Enlightenment reality or religious freedom? Was it a mixture of the two? Where is that coming from?
So I'm going to frustrate you by not dodging it, but answering it in a way that's authentic to me. This is a question that is debated over and over again. So
Sure,
I
yeah.
can't stick the landing on that. But I'm interested in that as an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
Where did this come from?
Yeah.
So I'll tell you, some candidates are Luther.
Sure.
I'm not endorsing this view,
No, right,
but Luther, you know, where you find this commentary, where did this quest for the authentic self, you know, where is the quest for the aggrandized self, where is the self-reliant self? Luther. Others will move, I mean, there's just a lot of, I mean, you could say with Descartes. I mean, I think therefore I am. So I don't have a handy answer to you, other than to say this is a question that has engaged, intrigued, vexed commentators, mostly when they're concerned about it. You know, so that this is a problem that we need to solve. Who got it going,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
If you're a little bit more provincial in your reading. Well, if you don't have to be provincial, you could, if you're reading, you know, European romantic texts, then you might say Goethe. I mean, not starting from nowhere, but Goethe is the figure who really, you know, brings this into our language. But I was going to say, if you take a slightly more provincial view, or you want to look for American homegrown, Emerson. So I don't mean to be wishy-washy in the answer, but to be genuine that it's a very, very good question. It's a one that's freighted with a lot, and it depends on how you conceptualize what that self. I mean, you know,
Sure.
what is that notion of the self that you're trying to suss out will tell you how you're going to do this genealogy,
Yeah.
right? So will it lead you back through religious channels? Will it lead you to Europe? Will it lead you to the Enlightenment? That, how you're going to do that depends on what you're thinking the problem is,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
I think of a couple things there, because I think you're right, it's the question in some ways. Part of it is the breakdown in a metaphysical vision. There was kind of a unified vision of objective truth and value, and so we share that, and the individual finds him or herself in relation to that world. If that falls apart, if people lose confidence in it, well, then what do? Well, then there's kind of a self-invention. But I also think it's something almost topographical, geographical. America, the land of novelty and new possibility, and these people on hugging the coast, and look at this giant continent before us. So we'll be a self-inventing people in a way that Europeans never could be. I mean, because
Right.
they were given something. Paul Tillich talks about freedom and destiny. Europe, in some ways, was a place of great destiny. It was something given to you. America, for all these reasons you've said, but also I think our geography invited. We're a land of freedom and possibility and novelty. you know. But I
And
think
new
that-
beginnings
New
and-
beginnings,
yeah.
right. A new frontier, or even JFK. That's a very American kind of idea. But the breakdown, I mean, I would say, and I say this, in a sort of mourning spirit, the breakdown of an integrated metaphysical vision of God, of moral value, of truth. When that falls apart, and then we can go back to Luther and many other figures too in the philosophical world, and also sociological reasons for that. Something, in my judgment, very bad happened to the human spirit. And the limit case then is the self-inventing subject, or the subject that invents value and truth. But we can get into that. But I think there's all kinds of interesting reasons why this now dominant idea is afoot.
Another major thinker that's in this book as well is Darwin. And what was his influence in the way Americans thought about each other, thought about nature, all of that?
Okay, that's a lot. There was Darwin's hugely influential in American thought. I mean, I can't. There are a handful of first movers, and he's kind of the first cause. Darwin's up there. So what was interesting to me when I started working more on thinking about the influence of Darwinism or Darwin's idea was that it upset the story that I had in my mind, which was Darwin writes Origin of the Species, 1859. And, it comes across the Atlantic, and people open up the book, and just their entire religious faith explodes, right? Nothing could be further from the truth. So when Darwin's ideas first make their way in the United States, they're actually read and accommodated by many religious commentators, religious thinkers, and across the whole spectrum. So there were more liberal Protestants who could read Darwinism and say, well, that actually kind of looks like our universe, right? A vision of progress, a sort of an ever-improving universe. We can do that. There were some more of, if you will, Calvinistic Protestants, and then also Catholic commentators who just said, well, no, he's wrong. But it was easy to swat away, because at the time it still seemed like a ludicrous proposition, right? So just like, and they had so much cultural authority. So there wasn't a huge explosive breakup or anything. It was just, he's wrong. So Darwin's ideas really, it takes a long time for Darwinism to become seen as a real threat to established religion. Darwin himself was a man of faith. So again, I think it's always important to separate what Darwin argued versus Darwinism. Whenever the name becomes an ism. Right. The other thing that happens in the United States that's I wouldn't say particular to the United States. I think it also happens in England, but in the United States, everything seems to happen with a little bit more gusto. Is that there was a lot of slippage between Herbert Spencer's ideas and Darwin. And Herbert Spencer, so when we talk about Darwinism and tooth and claw, that's not really Darwin, that's more Spencer, right? Yeah. So the Spencer is the one who says, well, if this is the law of the universe, then it's the law of human societies. We want laissez-faire, get the government off our back, the talented and the brightest
Survival
of the fittest, tooth and claw. And there's nothing in Darwin that endorses that view at all. Yeah. So that is the view that becomes popular, certainly in the Gilded Age, after Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age in the 19th century during industrial America. Yeah. So that's seen as Darwinism or social Darwinism is absolutely crucial to understanding the intellectual landscape. But it's not, you're hard-pressed to find this in Darwin's own writings. Yeah. It's his readers who then retool it and repurpose it in the way that a Herbert Spencer does, or let me talk about in my book, William Graham Sumner, who was a big proponent of this, in the United States.
I got from both your books with Darwin, I think you're right, he's a massively important figure, is the way it was received anyway was, okay, if species aren't fixed, species unfold. well then I guess nothing is really all that fixed. The moral values, intellectual values, everything seems to be in flux. And so that kind of relativistic view of things. But the guy that came to my mind a lot was a contemporary of Darwin and Emerson, all these people, namely John Henry Newman, who's kind of an intellectual hero of mine. Newman, as you say, took in all of this kind of Lebensphilosophie with a very blithe spirit. Newman, of course, intensely religious man, but he accepted evolution at the level of ideas. Ideas develop, they unfold over time, And for Newman, that never meant that now truth is relative. It just meant in the order of discovery, ideas take time to unfold. And you see it from an angle, I see it from an angle, now we talk.
Yeah.
You see it from a third angle. Now I listen to what Augustine said about it way back, and now I throw all that to someone else. And in that play of lively minds, Newman said, the idea unfolds, the way a river deepens and broadens over time, the way a tree grows. And what I always like about that is it doesn't fall prey to the either or of, okay, I guess our old world of fixed epistemic and moral values, that's all gone, everything evolved. Therefore, relativism or subjectivism, I say, no, therefore, a keener sense of the complex process by which an intersubjective conversation uncovers objective truth and value, So I wonder if that's kind of like a middle ground. We don't have to succumb to okay, everything's up for grabs. It's, no, we're just in a more interesting conversation. Another disciple of Newman's, whom I love, is Bernard Lonergan. And Lonergan said, the fault of a classical view is that knowledge is like taking a look. Oh, it's a form. Let's take a look. Oh, there it is. Well, it's hardly ever like that. I mean, there are objective epistemic and moral values, but I don't just take a look. But together, we look and argue and converse and throw ideas back and forth, and in the evolution of that, the full objectivity of that idea emerges. Hence Newman's famous line, a real idea is commensurate with the sum total of its possible aspects. Well, that's a very 19th century. It's a very Lebensphilosophie approach, but it's not a relativism or subjectivism.
Yeah.
Anyway, end of sermon on that. But that's why I think Darwin and Newman are very interesting to read together that way.
There's probably, I'm so glad that you drew on them because it just shows the range of serious thinkers, committed to living in a moral universe and contributing to that moral universe, trying to reckon with the implications of Darwin's ideas, even if it's not straight from, even if it's coming by way of other interpreters or what have you.
Yeah.
Another path, and this is the one that I think brushes up against what you're calling relativism, would be the way of the pragmatists. So American pragmatism, hugely important late 19th, early 20th century. It carries on throughout the 20th century, but it's taking shape at the turn of the last century. One of the real American, if you will, contributions to global philosophy.
Yeah.
It's sort of, nothing's homegrown because they're drawing also on foreign influences, but if you think of an American philosophy in the same way that transcendentalism almost a century earlier was. And the way that John Dewey puts it, so John Dewey, William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, this is the whole, the early classic pragmatists who are giving it shape. Dewey has a wonderful piece from, I believe it's 1910, but it might be a little bit earlier, on Darwin's influence on philosophy. And so what Dewey says in this, and is unmistakable, is Darwinism gives rise to pragmatism, which is, or at least aspired to be, a kind of middle ground between, absolute, unified, objective truth, transcendent truth, and everything just in massive flux and utter chaos leashed upon the world. So pragmatism was an effort to try to bridge, if you will, these two viewpoints. As William James puts it quite explicitly, it was for him a way to bridge a scientific view of the world and a religious view of the world. And for him, these were warring worldviews in his own lived experience. The poor guy, he had a couple, he's one of our most magnificent philosophers, but really suffered from this inner civil war between the claims of science and the claims of religious faith.
From his father's mysticism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Darwinism gives rise to pragmatism in the United States. And the way that Dewey puts it in a wonderful piece, and again, if readers or your viewers are at all interested, I'm sure you can just do a Google search and the full text will come up. But it is to say, if we take from Darwin a notion of the world ever becoming ever ever variable, without a telos, shouldn't that have an implication for the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we think about our moral world? So it has to have an implication for epistemology, if you will, cosmology, ontology. He takes it in a different direction,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
But that's where pragmatism comes from. It says if we recognize that there is no unified truth, again, a different point of departure than your Catholic theologians, how do we still build the moral life? You know, how do we still know how to live together? So pragmatism is, Darwinism, there's not a domain of American thought that's not eventually affected by it. But what's so fascinating is to see the incredible range of responses.
I've always loved James, really. I've read him with great profit over the years. And isn't it, in one of your books, you use that little term, ambulando, right? By walking. I've always thought there's a link between James and the phenomenologists. So not long after him, he dies 1910, and Husserl was writing, Russell's writing by 1905, you know. And what you have there, and Husserl, zu den Sachen selbst, back to the things themselves. He didn't want the Kantian divide between Newman and phenomena. He thought we could get access. But there's Lonergan again. He didn't think it was, like taking a look. Oh, there it is. There's the form. There's the essence. No, by this patient process, ambulando, walking around, looking at the various profiles of a phenomenon. Even James, the phenomenology of religion. I think, and that's very Newmanesque as well. There's the idea unfolding and developing. And I do think that's a helpful middle ground between, maybe certain naive classicism. And there's like a rarity that, is just the mirror of nature. There's nature, I got a mirror, and then it appears. And that's the taking a look thing, which is naive. But then not lurching to the other extreme of saying, well, there is nothing like, even let's say an asymptotically approached ideal, where you say, the truth, that's what I want. Lonergan, the mind wants to know everything about everything. The mind wants the truth. But knowing it's approached asymptotically, in this life, I'm never going to get it, end of argument. Newman would say, whatever I achieve, now there's more to be achieved, That more phenomenological Laban's philosophy approach, I think is a good path, and I've always liked that in the pragmatism. I've appreciated that. Without going to the extreme of it, which I think is somewhat dangerous.
Well, James saw pragmatism, his pragmatism was to, as he put it, widen the field for the search for God.
Yeah, that's right.
So, whether one can, quibble with him, or with the implications, but that was the spirit of what he was trying to do, was he wanted to come up with a philosophy that would not allow, let's say, science, and he actually has a list of the tough-minded versus tender-minded. So he has the science is the tough-minded, and he has these wonderful adjectives to shout down the longings of the seeking soul, or the religious spirit. So what he wanted was how can I come up with a philosophy that allows for both of these to be true in myself. The part of me that's an empiricist, that wants to see things really played out in experience, that wants evidence, and the part of me that has this kind of longing for transcendence and doesn't want my mind to shout down my heart. And the phrase he uses is that the pragmatism was to widen the field for the search for God. Again, not that he assumed everyone who's going to read it is going to become a person of faith, but to try to keep open a space in a modernizing America and a modernizing world that being a person of faith has legitimacy, has and can continue to have some sort of
intellectual
authority.
Integrity.
So it's just to say that's.
Do you agree with this? I think that's absolutely right about James, what you're saying. But I wonder, in his disciple John Dewey, something has been lost. That by Dewey you get more of an antagonism toward religion, which awakened, for example, Niebuhr in his opposition to Dewey. That they locked horns because by Dewey's time, it seems to me it's more of a strict kind of rationalism, and it's more suspicious of religion. But I think, in William James, you've got a great openness to it, which I've always appreciated.
Another major kind of shift as we see the Enlightenment influencing America is also this shift towards Romanticism. And I thought especially something in the American Nietzsche book that really stuck out to me was actually the influence of Emerson on Nietzsche. What was so powerful about Emerson?
Have you? I'm going to be a little cheeky here. Have you ever read him? I mean, that's my feeling on him. Like all you have to do is open it up, and that's not totally true. Some of my students would just say they don't get this guy. They don't understand it. But what I wanted to say is like just open up. The Harvard Divinity School Address, open up self-reliance, open up circles, open up experience. These are titles of some of his essays. And the power of the writing, the power of that mind. So anyway, but what did Nietzsche in particular discover in Emerson? So I guess for starters, the thing to note here is what seems like the impossibility. How is it that Emerson, the quintessential American philosopher, he wasn't the poet of democracy. He said that Walt Whitman was, but that was why, that he could even see that, right? So Emerson is someone who's deeply rooted to this place, America, and so much in the service of a democratic project. How is it possible that Friedrich Nietzsche, born later in the 19th century German philosopher who is seen as, and not inaccurately, as the prelude to fascism and totalitarianism. What? How is it possible? But the answer is, that's why we study history, because it's always much more interesting than the conventional tropes. So, you weren't necessarily pulling towards Nietzsche, but I wanted to maybe get to that. So Emerson, a hugely important early 19th century American thinker who is one of the transcendentalists, so a loose group of writers and poets and philosophers and theologians. I mean, lots and lots of theologians in this, preachers in this mix in the early 19th century, who were, the way that I like to put it is that they recognized that America had had a political break with England from the Revolution, but not really a cultural one, so that Americans in the early 19th century were still oriented on Europe for their ideas and their culture. And what the transcendentalists wanted to do was to come up with an organic American ideas, organic American identity. And that's where Emerson really gets his start. I mean, he started as a Unitarian minister, but then becomes a freelance philosopher and writer, all with this project in mind. So they're romantic in the sense, you could say it's a response to the rational aspects of the Enlightenment. So the Romanticism was a kind of, as the word says, a kind of bringing back of heart, of feeling, a sense of belonging. Others see it as just an extension of the Enlightenment project. I mean, that's a sort of intramural debate, I think, among intellectuals, and not a very, very interesting one. So Emerson's not the only one. Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau is in this orbit, Margaret Fuller, Theodore Parker, one of the most important abolitionists. They're all in this circle of American Romanticism, and really helping to launch lots of intellectual movements seeking for some sort of organic American identity, organic American culture.
And what in particular was it that Nietzsche really kind of grabbed onto that influenced him?
That's the connection. So Emerson was pretty much a rock star internationally. So he wasn't just famous in the United States, he had a very big following abroad.
Like Ben Franklin that way.
Yeah, exactly. So Emerson, his essays were in German translation, and a 16-year-old Friedrich Nietzsche, when he was at prep school in Naumburg, Germany, reads Emerson in the my dates are going to be a little bit off, but mid to late 19th century, whenever he was 16, reads Emerson in translation, and Nietzsche's on his path to becoming Nietzsche as a result of that. But before I carry on, maybe I'll let you
Yeah.
ask a question that you think might be interesting.
Maybe self-reliance and the whole, kind of throwing off of traditions and finding your path and asserting I think all of that. It was the single thing I found most interesting in your Nietzsche book as I read it. It's full of interesting things, but I've read Nietzsche and read at Nietzsche for many years. I never knew that connection, that he himself had embraced Emerson so enthusiastically.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating, because you say prototypically American sort of thinker, and yet influences Nietzsche.
And Nietzsche is seen as so German,
Yeah,
I
right,
mean,
it's
it's
so
such
foreign to
so
us.
other, so foreign, that especially becomes ingrained in the Nietzsche reception during World War I and World War II.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Nietzsche's otherness has always been part of his
Yeah, his-
reception here. And so that, I think, is the part that is so curious and shocking and interesting, is that Nietzsche found his own philosophical voice by reading an American philosopher.
Yeah,
it is.
So,
And I've always been intrigued by the transcendentalists. I think they are hugely influential. Look at much of the New Age today would be very much indebted, I think, to the transcendentalist insights. I would say now, speaking as a Catholic theologian, when the authentically supernatural is sort of marginalized, you get this sort of, I would say, Ersatz version, call it transcendence or Emerson's oversoul, which always reminds me a bit of Schleiermacher's sense of religion,
Sure.
the sense and taste for the infinite and so on. It was an attempt, yes, it's kind of a romantic thing, but also to present religion in a more kind of rationally acceptable way. And so is this sort of a universal experience we all have of the infinite, or, the feeling of absolute dependency in the later Schleiermacher? It always reminds me a bit of Emerson, the transcendentalist. But what happens when a supernatural vision of life has broken down? And you get a version of religion. And so that famous speech, right, that Emerson gives at Harvard when he kind of breaks ties, even with Unitarianism. So already a pretty de-supernaturalized. And even from that, he breaks, Something's happened in the American spirit there, and in the religious spirit, which I think still has ramifications today. I would see that rather negatively, What happens when a vibrantly supernatural, and now go back to Jefferson. Let's cut out all the supernatural elements.
Yeah.
So Jefferson is more austerely Kantian, I would say. It's more
Yeah.
religion as ethics. With Emerson, you get a kind of mysticism, but a sort of rationalized mysticism, a de-supernaturalized mysticism. Those elements, religion as ethics, religion as de-supernaturalized mysticism, they're all over the place today.
Yeah.
All over the place. And so to announce a supernatural Christianity, that's tricky, in that cultural framework. But anyway, I find that connection fascinating.
I always think about the quote from Alan Bloom that says Nietzsche is us, talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah,
us
right.
as
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah.
So for us to better understand Nietzsche's influence in regard to American culture, especially today, if there was maybe one or two of his ideas that have really held on, what would those be?
So I will give you one, channeling my inner Unitarian as opposed to my Trinitarian or whatever. But only because it's if you will, it's the foundation for all the influences. Yeah. So that Nietzsche's influence, and I don't think I'm being hyperbolic here at all, spent many years of my life, and hopefully I'm persuasive in the book. There's not a register in American thought where Nietzsche's influence is not felt.
Yeah.
Religion, politics,
Right.
culture,
Yeah.
gender identity. Just you name it, the environment. Nietzsche's influence. And those are not all the same Nietzsche, right? So they're different ideas. So if you want to limit it to a particular domain, so why in the environmental movement was Nietzsche important, or why in feminism was Nietzsche important, or why in Black Power was Nietzsche important? A very different Nietzsche shows up in all of those. So it's just he's so
Wide-ranging,
so wide-ranging. That there's a very, very, very long answer to that question. But if you pull all of them back to the one idea or the one claim, was that, and this will be familiar to any of your listeners, watchers who know something of Nietzsche, was that Nietzsche fundamentally challenged fundamentals. Or the foundation of Nietzsche's philosophy is what we would call anti-foundationalism. That is to say that there is no foundation to human experience. There are no absolutes, no a prioris, no universals, no objective truth, no God. Yeah? So what Nietzsche does, and this is I think, obviously there are forerunners of Nietzsche. There's Emerson, who doesn't make this radical a
No,
claim, but
right,
you can
but-
sort of like,
yeah.
it's sort of pointing in that direction.
Yeah.
So Nietzsche, part of what makes Nietzsche Nietzsche is just the force and,
Yeah, his rhetoric is
the
so powerful.
rhetoric and just the comprehensiveness. So again, it's not that Nietzsche ex nihilo is making these claims, where there's prior thinkers, but in Nietzsche they come together with such a kind of force and clarity, and a kind of, he's also making sociological claims too. So he works in a lot of registers. Is the idea that that there is no universal truth, and if human beings need to get over, he put it better than that. The way that he puts it, that is very famous and very arresting, but it's only one, is his phrase that God is dead.
And we've killed him.
And we have killed him, you and I.
Yeah.
So that's, then I can tell you how we get to an Alan Bloom saying
Sure.
in 1987, Nietzsche is us. These ideas have made their way so much into American framework that you can't think about American thinking without thinking about
Can I ask you a question about that? Because this is on my mind. Jordan Peterson has famously said that when Nietzsche makes that remark, it's not, and it's of course in Also sprach Zarathustra, so it's a character in Nietzsche,
Yeah.
but it's not a cry of exultation. God is dead, we killed him.
No, not at
It's
all.
a cry almost of despair.
Yeah.
It's a like acknowledgement of, now what?
Yeah.
Or what's the next step? God is dead and we killed him. Now what?
Yeah.
I've always felt that's more right than wrong, the way Peterson reads that.
It's way
Where-
more right than
yeah,
wrong.
but it's read often as this sort of exultant cry
Right.
of now I'm ready to find my freedom, where it's more like, oh my God, now what do I do in this blasted ground that I'm on, where
Yeah.
there is no God, there is no objective moral and epistemic value. Now what do I do? And as I read, this thought goes on. The existentialist finally saying, well, look, existence precedes essence. I mean,
Yeah.
my freedom comes first. You mentioned Richard Wright, in your book, and it's my project now of self-invention.
Yeah.
I determine my values. Or Sartre, I determine what makes my life authentic and so on. Now, for me, I'll speak as a Catholic priest and theologian, that's a pathetic alternative, in my judgment. To me, that's a suffocating space to live in. I with Dante and company, it's this great adventure as you intuit the great epistemic and moral values. And yes, indeed, you don't just take a look and there they are. You move into them in a complex process of conversation and moral adventure and so on. But to me, I've always found, as I say, it's a blasted earth to me of nothing. It's gone. There's no objectivity, and I have to invent it. God help me, what I have to invent. Anyway, I do think that's the neuralgic point.
No,
That's
so
the
there's so much that you're saying that is so resonant
Yeah.
for me. So, and I think it is really interesting. So
Yeah.
a couple of things is, even in the way that you've said it, God is dead. So there's a version where you can say God is
Yeah,
dead,
right.
right? And there's another one that is filled with terror.
Yeah.
And yearning.
Yeah, yeah.
And worry, and that's really. So it's you need to read the actual text.
Yeah, right.
Nietzsche. So the first statement, and then you understand Nietzsche, I think, also differently, too. So the kind of googly-eyed jester Nietzsche, who's
Yeah.
just taking joy in the death of God. That's not
Right.
what shows up in his text
I think
at all.
that's right, yeah.
So, so the statement about God is dead comes up actually prior to Also sprach Zarathustra in the Gay Science. So the first time the God is dead reference comes up is in a parable that Nietzsche tells in his Gay Science of, I believe it's 1882. And it's a parable of the madman comes down to the city square
Yeah.
and says to everybody, God is dead, God is dead. We have killed him, you and I. We have his blood stains on our hands.
Oh, that's from the Gay Science, not from
That's from the Gay
Zarathustra,
Science.
That one. Okay.
And then everybody laughs at him. It's like, who's
Yeah,
this
yeah.
lunatic?
Yeah, yeah,
and he
right.
says, oh, I've come too early,
Yeah,
so he
yeah,
leaves.
right, yeah.
And what Nietzsche is starting to experiment with there, what he's saying there, I think, is a challenge to Christians, but he recognized that they're not yet ready for it, which is to say that he looked around him in a modernizing German or Prussian, if you will,
Yeah.
society, and said, we have so many people going to church, but they're starting to pray to a God that they don't really believe in anymore because they're intellectually, the forces have either challenged it or undermined it. And so there's a way to read it where Nietzsche is actually challenging Christians to really think about their commitments and
think that's right.
not be half-hearted about it.
Right.
Like I'm just going to go to church on Sunday and keep keep the structure of Christianity, even though actually it's been debased of its real fame, or not real fame, real focus. And that's why I think so many theologians and very committed Christians have read Nietzsche and said Nietzsche is and I'm now using a quote, service to Christianity.
Yes.
I'm not insisting on
No,
that
no,
reading,
but
but like Nietzsche helps.
I quite
point
agree
out-
with you on that. And I want to get your reaction. I got two examples. One is Jung. Jung, who like Nietzsche, was born in a parsonage and grown up in a very Christian setting, and found the version of Christianity he was getting to be suffocating. But it didn't lead him toward a sort of Sartrean, existentialism. It led him toward this exploration of these other worlds, mythology and archetypal psychology. And he thought that it opened up the Christian thing in a new way. There's that. The second example is Paul Tillich, who was very influenced by Nietzsche, went through World War I and all of its horrors and all of its rigors, and ends up by recovering Meister Eckhart. And that's where he gets the Gott über Gott, the God beyond God. And so God is dead, we killed him. In a way, fair enough. There's a false view of God. There's an idolatrous view of God. We ought to kill him.
Yeah.
And that's frightening in the beginning, but finally liberating because it opens you to the Gott über Gott, the true God. So when Tillich uses the language of, Sein Selbst, God is being itself, he is trying to overcome idolatrous misconceptions of God. So that's where I quite agree with you that Nietzsche, maybe despite himself, was opening up, certain paths. The same way, you can read Marx that way too. Marx descended from a long line of rabbis, and Marx is filled with a passion for social justice, and also wants to get rid of a really false view of religion.
Yeah.
If religion functions as the opium of the masses, well then we should get rid of it. That's a dysfunctional religion. So anyway, I quite agree with you. I think Nietzsche opens up paths for a deeper reflection.
There are also other paths that people can take, but that it is to say that's the curious thing about Nietzsche is us in terms of religious readers. Many serious-minded religious readers come to a deeper understanding and if you will, James refers to this as being twice born. Coming to the faith by way of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche, in their reading, helps them see the shortcomings in the way the way that they understood their inherited faith.
I'm with that.
So there is a version of Nietzsche which leads to Paul Tillich. Right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a version of Nietzsche even earlier, someone I talk about in my book, who I think is super fascinating, is a Baptist minister by the name of George Berman Foster, who in the early 20th century was the first reader. I think he's really the first death of God theologian. What happens if we take this seriously? But for Foster, again, it was a way of kind of reconstituting and thinking of his faith. So there is a version of that. Thomas Merton refers to Nietzsche as a prophet, and he doesn't like everything he has to say, but he says Nietzsche helps us improve our Christianity.
And Merton would have known those great mystical sources.
Absolutely.
The God über Gott sort of thing.
Exactly.
He would have been
He's also in that orbit. However, as you, I think, have signaled, there is a version of that then leads to the Uber Ich, just the self, the self. There's no God over God. It's just me and myself, myself, and I.
Right.
What Tom Wolfe called the me generation, the third great awakening. What Robert Bellah in Habits of the Heart referred to as Sheilaism, which was a woman, unfortunately, I think, not a very flattering portrait, but as someone who, was sort of self-actualized and, doing a sort of pastiche religion, and then the question that she was asked in the 80s is, who do you worship? And she said, me. I do, her name was Sheila, I do Sheilaism. So there is a path, right?
Yeah.
That just leads to a fully secularized, aggrandized ego with no higher structures of meaning,
Yeah.
no sense of belonging, no sense of the beloved community.
Yeah, yeah.
And unfortunately, I think, well, I say unfortunately, in my humble opinion, it's unfortunate that much of this is not America. is the America is us, which Bloom is also lamenting, but it's not the. I think it's some of the sources of our great problems of our day.
And it's a great obstacle to evangelization. So in my work, I come up against that all the time. Versions of Sheilaism, and
Yeah.
who are you to tell me what to believe? I got my own religion. Or who are you to tell me there's something objective at the epistemic or moral level? So I'm up against that all the time.
I'm sure.
So I think that what we're saying here is interesting, of finding a path from Nietzsche that is much more agreeable to religion. I think you can find that, and avoid the ones that lead us to trouble in terms of evangelizing the culture.
What's incredible, we only have a few minutes left in
we
this
do?
conversation. This has been a fantastic
fantastic.
conversation. But one question I did want to ask, in our work, and of course Bishop Barron's been doing it now for over 15, 16 years, is evangelizing the culture. And kind of we started off this conversation talking about why knowing the history of ideas is so important. And I wanted to ask you, as Bishop Barron's been an evangelist for 15 years, and with the Institute, we're trying to train people on how to spread the gospel. What maybe advice might you have?
boy.
I'd love to hear that.
I'm interested in this conversation.
Yeah.
We need another hour. And I don't have answers, but but this intrigues me.
Yeah, please.
And I'm probably not the right person to ask this
Sure.
question, and I'll tell you why. Because I have to be very careful not to evangelize in my classroom.
Yeah.
And what do I mean by that in terms of what my politics are, my views of things, even me allowing myself to wag my finger at Sheilaism is something that it's not that I don't do it in the classroom, but I have to be really mindful.
Sure.
In a classroom, I've got students from all over with all different types of
Yeah.
faith traditions, no faith tradition, their politics point in every direction. And I can't do anything to undermine, I don't want to do anything where they feel disrespected or they don't feel like it's a space for them to think
Yeah.
through ideas. And if they think I'm in any way an ideologue, they or have
Indoctrinating them.
yeah. So I it's funny, I'm often on the search for rooting out in myself when I hear something that I really want to tell them.
Yeah.
But here's what I do let myself tell them, and I think we need more time than we have, but that's fine. We can also just go with this and think about it, is that I think that my job, like this is definitely part of the job description, is to just awaken them to the absolute pleasures of the mind.
Yeah.
The absolute pleasures of the intellectual life.
Yeah.
And again, wherever it may be found. So again, I'm not, it's this canon or it has to be that. But the coming into contact, as you do all the time, with ideas, with formidable theories, with contradicting viewpoints, and you wrestle with it, there's an agon in there, right? It's intense, but there's also an incredible joy to it too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's something that I allow myself to do in the class, which is I don't want to land too hard on verdicts about certain kinds of things that could alienate students, but this one I'll land on.
that's
The
good.
joys of
The joys
the
of the-
joys and the pleasures and the necessity of the examined life.
Yeah.
And so here's where I think maybe we're not so far apart. Actually, is that I think. So what I find in that situation is the vast majority of my students come yearning for something. They might not know what it is,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They often don't. Why should they? They're 18, they're 19.
Right.
I'm
They
middle
don't
age
know
and
what
I'm
they
still trying to
want.
figure it out, right? But there's a yearning for some larger structure of meaning,
Yeah.
some sense of orientation, some we, And if my job can say history is a way to get there, being involved in this, then I joke, Diana, like my job. I feel like my job has been done. But where the similarity is for you is you're also amidst people with yearning, with longing, with uncertainty, and so I guess there's a couple of things that I would say. One is showing Catholicism as a deeply meaningful intellectual tradition.
Yeah,
Like, you want to get your needs met, you can come here.
And a lot of people don't know that.
No,
Even
I think
Catholics,
that's-
they don't know
no,
how
no, no.
rich the intellectual tradition
And
is.
in that, so that's like intellectually, there's a lot of place here, a lot of place, that's an understatement, to really get your needs met. And to come alive and to let your moral imagination unfurl. So
Yeah.
there's one, that.
Yeah.
And then two, just recognizing that people are, as I think you do, they're coming with so much yearning.
Yeah.
And so if you're able to show just the grounding work of what you do, the life-affirming, soul-nourishing work of what you do, you can't help but to evangelize,
Yeah.
right?
No, that's good. It's funny, it just occurred to me in the course of our conversation, the weird connections. So we talked about Emerson, let's say, influencing Nietzsche. We talked about Emerson maybe indebted to 19th century, liberal Protestantism. Emerson, a de-supernaturalized view. All that, I think, is true. Emerson influences massively Walt Whitman, this great American poet, right? And you can look at Whitman's religion or spirituality, and you can find it, maybe a lot of those same elements, and, good and bad, but limited. But there's this young Englishman, late 19th century, who's coming of age in a very nihilistic university culture, and was even on the verge of suicide. And he reads the poetry of Walt Whitman, and it opens him to a fresh and invigorating view of the world. It eventually led him to a reconsideration of Christianity, and eventually he becomes a Catholic, and that young man's name was G.K. Chesterton,
Yeah.
who becomes, one of the great Catholic apologists of the 20th century, influencing C.S. Lewis, influencing Tolkien. Now there's a new generation of Chestertonians.
Yeah.
But it was Walt Whitman, no kidding, it was Walt Whitman who opened him up to this perspective. I don't know really what my point is, except to say the history of ideas is really weird and interesting. And the cross-pollination is really intriguing of
Yeah.
who influences whom and why. And so the more we know about that, the more we're open to it, the more possibilities there are,
Yeah.
So, heck, I can easily imagine, actually, Friedrich Nietzsche opening someone to a deeper perception of the faith. I really could. If they go the Gott über Gott sort of route, or they see something in Nietzsche's critique of religion that, yeah, that's right, and there's got to be something better, So who knows? Who knows, now I'll speak as a theologian, how the Holy Spirit's going to work, what the Holy Spirit will use to move people to faith, So I think the more we know about that world,
nicely
the
put.
more
I
fun
like
it is, the
that.
more
That's-
intriguing it is,
Thank you.
Well, thank you again for being with us, and this was just a
Yeah, it was a
fantastic
delight.
conversation.
And wonderful
and
for
so
me
much
too. Thank you.
insight in this conversation, so
Thank
thank
you.
Bishop,
Yeah,
great to be with
thanks.
you as always.
I'm Dr. Anthony Pagliarini.
I'm Dr.
I teach
Holly
theology
Woodway.
at the University of
I'm
Notre Dame.
Christopher Kaiser, professor of philosophy at Nelson.
And I'm Stacy Trasankos.
Todd Warner. I'm an internal medicine teacher.
Father Stephen Gadbury, priest for the Diocese of
Well, a very special greeting to all the members of the Word on Fire Institute. Good to be back with you.
Today, we're going to be talking about imaginative apologetics. Now, imaginative apologetics is the name of our course overall.
In the coming lessons, we'll be looking at what I call the 4 integral features of the Catholic narrative.
Because this whole series is about how we are to evangelize the culture, and it's that Jesus wants us to go out and not be afraid to do just that.
Newman enumerates the principles of Christianity. Principle of dogma, we've seen.
I teach the literature of the mystical tradition at the Angelicum University. And